This is KGNU Boulder, 88.5 FM, with translator K260AC in Fort Collins, Colorado, at 99.9 MHz, and translator K229AC in Ward, Colorado, at 93.7 MHz. And now we have Hemispheres. And welcome to Hemispheres, this special Christmas Eve edition. This evening in the studio, we're joined by Dr. U Kyaw Win and Inge Sargent, both local activists on the issue of Burma and helping to bring about democratic reform in that troubled country. But welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Well, I wonder if you could bring our guests up to speed on what has been going on around the country and locally with the effort to economically isolate the ruling military junta in Burma.
As far as the efforts to isolate Burma economically are concerned, there was a bill introduced in Congress by Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky called the Burma Freedom and Democracy Act, which has been tabled a couple times, and it's going to make another round in 1997. Basically, the law would deprive Burma of economic aid from international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, because the U.S. would be vetoing all loan applications. And it would prevent American companies to do business with that rogue regime. And the law has many other details. The minute parts would be to have diplomatic representation with Burma on a reciprocal basis at the same level of representation we have there. America does not have an ambassador on the scene at the present time. The last ambassador there was Burton Levin, who was there during the 1988 uprising. But Burma does have an ambassador in Washington. What this would do would be to downgrade the level of Burma's diplomatic representation in Washington to that of a chargé d'affaires, which the United States has in Rangoon. Now, on the grassroots level, since Congress has been sitting on its duff as far as sanctions go, there has been a movement called the Free Burma Coalition, started by a young man, a student from Burma, Zani by name, and he uses the internet extensively, and it's picking up steam. This is to boycott companies, which does not require any national legislation, boycott the companies that do business in Burma like Pepsi-Cola, Unocal, Texaco, and Total in Colorado, by urging people not to purchase the goods and services of these companies that prop up the military regime in Burma, which is heavily involved in drugs. So that is what the current situation is.
Yeah, I would like to add to that actually our administration in Washington already has a tool, and that is a kind of a watered-down amendment to the foreign aid bill to impose sanctions on Burma. And the administration has not done so, although they have all the good reasons to impose those sanctions. Namely, I think the law says that should this present government of Burma, which calls itself SLORC, it's a combination of a few generals, very cruel and corrupted generals, and our amendment says, the Cohen-Feinstein amendment to this, which is a watered-down version of the bill, the McConnell-Moynihan bill, which Dr. Kyaw Win talked about. Well, this Cohen-Feinstein amendment says that our administration can go ahead and impose sanctions any time that the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi and the democratically elected leader of the country of Burma is further harmed or threatened, that the president could impose sanctions, and he has not done so, and I'm personally very disappointed in that. Now, we do hope that eventually the federal government will use the tools it has in its hand and do something about the situation there, because Aung San Suu Kyi is in grave danger. And I think, I also agree, the grassroots level efforts have picked up, and I really think that we have to give very high respects and thanks to the Boulder City Council for having passed a selective purchasing resolution on December 17th, just a few days ago, making Boulder the 9th U.S. city to say that our city will not spend any of our taxpayers' money on companies that do business in Burma.
And I understand the state of Massachusetts has also initiated a boycott. Are there efforts here in Colorado to get the state?
Massachusetts was the first state in the union. Governor Wells signed that, and he has written to the remaining 49 state governors to follow Massachusetts' example likewise. So in terms of states, Massachusetts is the first one, and we hope others will come. We in Colorado would like to target the Colorado State Legislature after doing some groundwork, and we hope that we can be number 2 in the nation in that respect.
Have you had contacts with any of the legislators so far?
Yes, actually, I have contact with one senator in the state, Dorothy Rupert, who is very understanding and very interested. She went to Beijing for this women's conference where Aung San Suu Kyi, for instance, was prevented from attending and opening the session. So we do hope very much that she is going to press this, and we do hope that it's going to be another bipartisan effort, because that's what's happening in the Congress, that's what's happening in the House. But this is not just a partisan issue, it's a bipartisan issue. There are people from both parties who are just really shocked and fed up with what's been going on, and here we are celebrating Christmas, and spending and trying to be happy, and we know that people there are being tortured, being killed, are starving to death, are being relocated. And so there are many people like Dr. Kyaw Win and myself who say, well, no more, we cannot just watch that anymore, we got to do something. And fortunately, there are many people in the community. I mean, Boulder was wonderful. And to quote the Deputy Mayor Spence Havlick, he said that this was an unprecedented amount of mail that the city council members received from all members of the community who were almost without exception supportive of this boycott and said, we got to get involved, we cannot watch this, let's do something. And they've never seen so much mail in support of a grassroots issue as our selective purchasing ordinance.
That's interesting, people coming out to take a stand for human rights. I suspect, though, that for a lot of people, Burma is a bit of a mystery. It is so far away. And I even had to do a little looking up in the atlas just getting ready for the show just to make sure I knew where Burma was, situated kind of between India and Thailand on the Indian Ocean. I wonder if you could tell us, the two of you, a little bit about the history of Burma.
Yeah, maybe Dr. Kyaw Win should start because he was born there. I only went there when I was a young adult, and so maybe we should tell a little about our background. And then
Burma is out of the ordinary American mainstream consciousness by design, because the military dictators deliberately, after taking over power in 1962, shut the country. They wouldn't allow foreign newsmen to come in. They wouldn't allow tourists to come in. At first, they allowed 24 hours for people transiting the country. They had to go from one direction, west to east or east to west, Calcutta to Thailand or Thailand to Calcutta in 24 hours. Then extended that to about 7 days, and now they are groping for money, so they want tourists to come, and they have started what is called the Visit Myanmar Year, a tourist promotional year, which just began last month. But going back to history, Burma was a British colony for almost a century. The first British annexation having taken place in 1824, and it was ruled as an appendage of India, the British Indian Empire. The Burmese resented that. They fought, saying, we are not Indians, we are Burmese, so rule us separately. And that was that movement, and there was some bloody riots involved. But in 1940, in the early 40s, a group of young Burmese nationalists who were at that time students at the University of Rangoon, the name that stands out singularly is that of Aung San, who is the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner of 1991. He and a coterie of young men, about 29, 30 of them, went to Japan. First, they initially went to China, actually, to seek Chinese help to overthrow the British. But the Chinese gave them the short shrift, so the Japanese seized upon that opportunity and said, here, a nice opportunity for us to exploit this situation. And the Japanese embraced them, and they trained 30 and then more young people to march at the vanguard of the invading Japanese troops into Burma.
So this would have been during the
This is World War II,
wars of World War
1941, right after Pearl Harbor. In fact, the first Japanese soldiers showed up on Burmese soil concurrent with the invasion of Pearl Harbor, bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And Burma was ruled by the Japanese. It was occupied for about 3.5 years, and the relationship between these Burmese nationalists and the Japanese turned sour because the Japanese had their own agenda. They promised the Burmese that they would be given freedom from the British and all that, but they ruled Burma with a very harsh military authority, and the Burmese did not like it. And they said, "What have we done to ourselves now? We've gotten from the frying pan out of the frying pan into the fire." So Aung San again went and courted the British to come back and get rid of the Japanese. And they said to the Japanese, "We would like to have independence," and the British were quite willing, and Burma became independent of the British Empire on January 4th, 1948. So that was Burma as an independent country. For the period between 1948 and about 1962, there was a kind of a fledgling democratic movement. There were elections, and the people were very jubilant, happy, and it was like a prisoner who's been in prison for a long time being let out, and he doesn't know quite how to behave. He thinks everything is free, and Burma had a fledgling democracy, but things didn't always go right. There were politicians that were corrupt, just like anywhere else. So the military used that as an excuse and says the country is falling apart. And another dimension to that was, of course, Burma being a country made up of many ethnic peoples. The ethnic people said, the British annexed us as part of the British colony, but we really have our own culture, our own language, and we really were not a part of this Burmese hegemony, the Burman hegemony. So they said, the British left us out in this formula for independence. So they started crying for statehood and their own national interests, and a civil war erupted. So just about the time the ink on the Declaration of Independence dried, there was a civil war brewing, and the communists started first, and the Karens and the Kachins and the Shans. So the military under General Ne Win, whose name emerged out of nowhere, he was just one of those soldiers that worked his way up, came and he said, well, we're going to take over the country because the country is falling apart, and clamped on a harsh military rule that went from 1962 to this present day. Burma is a very controlled country, and people are very unhappy, and they don't know what to do with it. There were many things in between, but let's stop here at this moment.
Now, Mrs. Sargent, you ended up a princess in Burma during those years.
Yes, and I should explain that. First of all, though, I want to talk about the people always ask, well, now, is it Burma or is it Myanmar? Myanmar is the other pronunciation. And as far as we are concerned, it is Burma until the people have a choice to change that to themselves. Moreover, the word Myanmar means Burmese in Burmese. So does Burma or Burma. And it's the word Myanmar is not even a noun, it's an adjective. So it would be like calling this country American. American what, And we don't, neither Aung San Suu Kyi nor the UN, there are many places that do not use Myanmar. Unfortunately, some of our newspapers have an editorial policy like the Denver Post, and they said you must use Myanmar. And the Slok generals, they are the ones who renamed the country in 1989 after massacring, killing we think 10,000 people, and then they wanted to start with a clean slate. So that's Myanmar versus Burma. So we are going to refer to it as Burma. Of course, people who do that in the media, they are never allowed back in again because these generals now want it to be Myanmar. So
luckily KGNU is community radio, so
that's right.
So we can do it here.
Yeah, thank you. So anyway, as far as my background, and Dr. Kyaw Win just was talking about those ethnic groups, there are about 67 major ethnic groups, and about 40% of Burma is made up of ethnic people. And by ethnic, I mean they are not only different in looks, or so they're completely different in language, some of them different in religion, in culture, in everything. And during the British time, most of those places were administered under the frontier administration, and those people were not a colony. And so that is where some of these problems came. Now, my first husband, whom I met in 1951, thank you very much, 1951, 52, in Colorado, was a Shan, a ruling prince of the Shan ethnic group. And he was an absolutely feudal prince who was, I think there were three areas which the then already federal government during this golden time after getting independence from Britain and before the army took over. During that time, I mean, his state was about the size of Connecticut, and there were only 3 areas which he did not administer, and one of them was foreign affairs, the other was defense in foreign countries, and the third, I think, was the monetary, and everything else he was it. In spite of that, he decided that, being a feudal prince wasn't quite enough for helping the people, and he was very democracy-minded. So he came to the Colorado School of Mines to study mining engineering to really help his people economically, and that's where I met him. Except I didn't know he was a prince, and so the surprise came after we got married and went back, which is a long story which I describe in a book I wrote. But anyhow, I came back there, and there I was all of a sudden, an absolute princess of one of the Shan states in an ethnic group on the road to Mandalay, the Burma road from Mandalay to China. And I was far away from Rangoon, from where all this thing happened, the political intrigues. And so I helped my first husband really modernize our state, and we were like a little Peace Corps. We were working on economics, on mining, on agriculture, on child rearing, on education, name it, we did it, on nutrition, and we were extremely happy and also extremely popular, because my first husband, although he was a feudal prince, one of the first things he did was give away his paddy fields, which is, that's your wealth in a country like that. And he was very unlike many of the other feudal rulers around him. He was not the only one. And so I supported him, and we were very happy. And of course, he worked towards giving up this feudal rule to a democratic, more or less democratically elected group within this Union of Burma, to a central Shan state. And of course, as soon as they had given up those powers of ruling in 1959, he was voted back into the Senate. So, the people really wanted him, they loved him, they loved both of us. So in 1962, when General Inge Win took over, and he had a personal grudge against feudals and my first husband in particular, and so, of course, this General Inge Win, who is still alive, who is kind of the grandfather or the father of the army, well, he had, during his coup d'etat on March 2nd, 1962, he had everybody arrested, the Supreme Court, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the major administrators, everybody you could think of was arrested, and a few were killed, and among them was my first husband. And I was put, that was in 1962, I was up country. I was under house arrest as a CIA spy with 2 small children. I didn't even know what the CIA was, but I had spent a year in America. And so there was all this hate thing going on, that my first husband was wanting to secede from the Union. And of course, he was the one who said it would never work to have an independent, separate little Shan state up here cut off from everybody was not feasible. And he believed in in freedom of speech, in democracy, in working things out. And that's what he got in return. He got killed, and up to today, it's over 34 years ago that they killed him, and this chicken government hasn't had the courage and the guts to admit that they have killed him. I have evidence, I have eyewitnesses, and every year our daughters who are we're all U.S. citizens now very proudly, they write, and the response is always none. I mean, the government doesn't even have the courage to admit that they have killed him. He was a born leader, and he would have been able to make a difference.
So 1962, there's a big change. The military takes over.
Mm-hmm.
And how was the military at that time supporting itself?
Well, the military budget in Burma is about 60% of the national treasury. That is an inordinately high amount, considering the fact that Burma has no enemies from the outside whatsoever. How the military supports itself, of course, is a military is almost a nation within a nation. So that's how they support themselves. In the early part of the Burmese military regime, of course, they had lots of foreign aid from the United States and other countries. At that time, in the early 60s, the United States was in the midst of the Cold War, and they were courting the newly independent countries of Southeast Asia not to veer away from the path and go to the communist bloc. And now China is a very real threat in Asia, and the United States and Western countries did their utmost to keep Burma out of the Chinese sphere of influence. So that's how the military supported itself. Now, how does the military support itself now? I refer listeners to 3 articles, all in December month. One is the Outside magazine, the December issue, called In the Monsoon Twilight and the Clamor. Another one is the People of the Opiate, which appears on the December 16th issue of The Nation magazine, and yet another one in the Current History magazine, a journal, the December issue. All of a sudden, Burma is picking up lots of media attention. Heretofore, it had been ignored. People didn't seem to care because the generals locked up the country, and of course, Burma is not as urgent as what's going on in Bosnia or Somalia or the Soviet Union breaking up. So these are 3 pieces I would urge listeners to look into. The University of Colorado each year for the past 47 years has been having this conference on world affairs. And I asked the convener of this conference, Professor Sven Steinmohr, why don't you do something on Burma? He said, nobody asked for it. Well, I said, one of the functions of the university is not to wait until the people ask for it. It's for us to lead and let the people know what's going on. So I hope listeners will call and inundate his office with requests to have something on Burma done at this forthcoming conference, which is from April 7th to 11th, 1997.
Well, I'd like to pause, I guess, for a minute in the 1960s. During the period of the Vietnam War, what was happening in Burma?
What was happening in Burma? Nothing externally, because Burma was completely neutral. It stayed out. It didn't let anybody come in, and Burma was totally closed. And the Burmese army was building itself up in anticipation of staying in power for the rest of their lives. So externally, Burma did not participate in anything to do with Vietnam or any other SATO, for example, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. I don't know how many listeners remember that one, but that was a big thing, the brainchild of the Secretary of State of the time, John Foster Dulles, under President Eisenhower. Burma shunned all alliances with outside countries, and it says it remains neutral, but Burma was the leader of this neutral non-aligned countries movement, but it pulled out later on when the neutrality, they said they were not really neutral, they were turning against some of the smaller countries, and it was the walking stick of the imperial powers. So in the 60s, Burma's foreign policy was zero. There was no foreign policy. It was just purely domestic. Things were being nationalized, schools were nationalized. Everything that people owned became the property of the state meaning the military.
And that's the period of time, I think, when a lot of Americans became aware of the Golden Triangle.
Yeah, I think that goes back really to the KMT and China, in the Mao Zedong's troops and the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek's troops. When there was the battle for China, there was a group of Chinese who were loyal to KMT, to Chiang Kai-shek, who did not get repatriated to Taiwan, but they stayed in the Golden Triangle area. They're called KMT or Kuomintang troops. And they sustained themselves by cultivating opium in that small area. And that was already in the 50s. I actually, when I was there, I lived there from 1954 or 1953 to 1964. And at that time, the Golden Triangle had already become an opium-producing area. But I also know that you had to go east of the Salween River to see opium fields. And for instance, I never saw any. I was there for 12 years, but I lived on the western side of the Salween, never saw any opium fields, but I heard about it. And I was also told at that point that there were 50 tons of opium produced. And it was as a result of those KMTs who were cultivating it, growing it in areas which were very hard, almost inaccessible. And those 50 tons of opium, we talked about it with U Nu, then Prime Minister of Burma, and he said that they were being watched and cultivated and sold under the auspices of some United Nations pharmaceutical company, most of it. Now, I lived there for 12 years, and I knew 2 people who were on opium. 2. I didn't know anybody else. And now, we have to go back to now, because now the country produces 2,500 tons of opium. And I think this is when Dr. Kyaw Win said, look at those 3 publications that tell you what's going on there now. Now where everything in the country is under the control of the army, every little function, every little birthday party you give for a 4-year-old child, every time you have anybody outside of the family staying overnight with you, you have to register them. Everything is controlled, and yet the opium is, 2,500 tons versus 50 tons when I lived there. And we know that the SLORC, the military, is involved in the cultivating, in the processing, and in the selling of the opium, and in the process of making it into heroin, and now they're flooding our markets. And I think that's one of the reasons why we really think Burma, yes, it is far away. It is something, it's a country very few people know anything about, but it is endangering our country, our streets, and our young people. And that's why we really appeal to anybody who has any kind of responsibility to go and speak up now before it's too late.
Well, let's take ourselves up to 1988 and the takeover by SLORC. What changed? What's different between the military structure that was ruling the country since '62 and now?
From '62 to approximately 1988, the military regime in stages shed its garb and says, we are now a civilian government. The generals became ordinary people, and they instituted what was called the Burma Socialist Program Party, of which only one political party was allowed in the whole country. And the path for steering the country economically, politically, socially was the Burmese way to socialism, which was supposed to be different from everything else.
Because at the time, Burma, of course, didn't have a relationship with the Soviet Union.
No.
And so they're not adopting a socialist model as understood in the world.
The Burmese definition of socialism is not communism, and yet it's just the generals looking out for their own pocketbooks.
Which sounds a lot like the Nazis using the word socialism.
Just like the German Democratic Republic, which was neither democratic nor a republic, of course, when the Germany split into 2. So what happened in '88? It was a series of disenchantments with the government. The first thing the military government did was in July of 1962. See, they took over power in 1962 March. And one night, the Burmese engineers went and wired up the Student Union building, a magnificent edifice, a monument to Burmese architecture. They just blew it up. One morning, the citizens of Rangoon were awakened by this loud explosion which could be heard miles and miles around. The reason was that the University of Rangoon had always been, continues to be, the hotbed of political activism. Students always are at the forefront when it comes to going on strike or passing out leaflets against. So in 1988, things came to a boil. What really drove them to this desperate situation was that just about a year before that, the government devalued the currency. In Burma, the people don't trust the banks. They don't put the money in the bank, so they put them under the mattress or they carry it around in a bag. So General Ne Win, who was the head honcho of the Revolutionary Council at that time, devalued the currency, in effect knocking off 60% of the currency in circulation. And the people that were hit the hardest were students. They were having final exams at that time. This was in September. And the allowances that parents sent them were worthless. So they took to the streets and said, this military government has to go. They started passing out leaflets in the streets, in the pagodas and temples. And the movement gathered such momentum that the streets of Rangoon had never seen that many people in its entire history. There must have been several million. Every day they were demonstrating, they were saying, down with the military, we want a multi-party democracy. And then on August 8th of 1988, 8/8/88, the 4/8 day, the students called for a general strike. Everything in the country was going to come to a standstill. Well, the military responded by saying, you guys come to work or we're going to shoot you. And shoot they did. They massacred, several thousand. Nothing was accounted for. That was in August of 88. Then finally, on September 18, 1988, the army said, we're going to stop this nonsense. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they put on martial music on the radio, and then the tanks rolled in, the APCs moved in, and they started shooting up. There must have been at least 10,000 people killed in the whole country. Rangoon alone, maybe 3,000 or more. And they cremated these bodies overnight. Some of those they cremated were not even dead yet. The parents were told not to come and claim the bodies. Rangoon was in a state of terror. So that's what happened in 1988. So from 88 to now, they are trying to project a clean image. They changed the name of the country to Myanmar, which is not a change at all, really. Myanmar Nainga is what we've always called ourselves in the Burmese language. And they need capital. They say that the state-controlled economy has been a flop. They acknowledge that. We are now going into this free market, and they're inviting foreign companies to come in and exploit the riches of the country. Burma is a very rich country, richest in Asia in terms of natural resources. But the government has mismanaged, and it's now reduced to that of a very poor country. So that's what's happening right now.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about the people who are the organized opposition?
Yeah, before that, I would like to also add, I was there in 1962 when they blew up the student union, and I also wanted to say that I was in Rangoon at that point, and I saw that the students were already at that time protesting, and all they were doing is walking around the town carrying banners saying, today it's People's Bank #1, #2, because everything was nationalized, and tomorrow it'll be People's Toilet #1, #2. That infuriated army so much they shot into those students and loaded them onto trucks. I saw part of that, put them in the student union, and then they blew up the student union with injured and dead students in it. And there are still people there whose children disappeared and they don't know what happened. And the same thing in 1988 happened. And it was the year before Tiananmen Square, and Tiananmen Square in Beijing was very well publicized because CNN was there. And of course, Burma being completely isolated, there were no foreign news people there. So what happened in 88 is not known, except of course if people do want to go and see the movie Beyond Rangoon. And the Burmese part there of the uprising and so is very, very much. What I want to say, yes, the opposition is thanks to the internet, and maybe Dr. Kyaw Win would talk more about this, but what I want to bring up before it's too late, and that is that this present military regime, which is following this free market economy and so is propped up and aided by some of our multinational companies, and that is what this opposition movement is for or against. We are against people like Unocal, Texaco, Total of France, and Total here is owned by Total of France and some other companies that are taking our good money into Burma and propping up this ruthless, murderous regime. And I think they should account to us, and that's what we are for, and that's what the opposition is working on. Get to those ruthless generals and so on by hitting them where it hurts most, and that's in their pocketbook. And we have been very encouraged by the grassroots movement of the opposition, saying stop spending our good money over there and going into a partnership with the Burmese SLORC or the military and helping them, which U Kyaw, for instance, is doing. They're giving them loans. Everybody, not the banks, IMF and World Bank are not giving them any loans because they said their money, the Burmese money, is, most of their economy is extra. It's not legal. It's a drug economy, really.
50%, according to the figures I was reading.
And so they say, they're not getting loans, but it's those companies. It's some of our own companies that are spending our money there and helping them. And that's what the opposition is really working against. And maybe you, Dr. Kyaw Win, will tell you more about the really how it came about and the organization of it.
Let me take you back to 1988. So the military moved in, brutally crushing, and then they said, all right, you people in the streets want to have multi-party democracy. We'll give it to you. So they encouraged people to form political parties. There were over 250 of them that registered. Well, the perks that went with the registration was that each party, whether there be 2 people or 3, was entitled to 1 telephone line. Telephone lines were at a premium, very hard to get, and they were given rations for gasoline so that they could move. And then the military strategy, of course, was that, sure, if they have 250 parties running in an election, they're all going to cast 1 vote here, 1 vote there. So the result is that the military is going to come out with a clean majority and we're going to win, the military's party. Well, they miscalculated. They miscalculated gravely. So the National League for Democracy, which was started by Aung San Suu Kyi and 2 or 3 other colleagues, came out the victorious one, and much to the military surprise, it garnered 395 seats in Parliament out of 485. So the military started to hem and haw and find ways how to get out of this morass that they were in. They said, well, at first they said, we're going to audit your accounts, make sure that you guys had the right money, and then they disqualified some, saying you won this election by cheating or not filing the project form, and then they went on and dragged their feet. Finally, the task fell on the commander of the Rangoon military district. The SLORC generals probably said, you go and make a statement saying we're going to honor this. So he came out with a statement saying, none of you guys who got elected are worthy of this job. You are not qualified to serve, therefore we're not going to turn over power to you. Just like that, one sentence, and out they went.
So that's 1990.
1990, they had elections.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what happened.
May I also add here that the military, they told everybody, you better vote for our party. Well, they got between 2 and 3% of the vote.
They won 11 seats in Parliament.
11 seats. And Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, the National League for Democracy, she won fair and square, and it was like 82% of the votes cast went to her. Although she was already under house arrest for a year, she was not allowed to campaign, and yet the people spoke. And this was the first election they had in a long time.
30 years.
Yeah.
Now, what is the ideology of the National League for Democracy?
The National League for Democracy, the first thing they said is the military has to go back to the barracks. They have no business running the country. Number 2, the people of the country must be given the choice to select the type of government and the representatives they want. Those are the number 2 things. National League for Democracy is a non-violent political party. They are the only ones in existence because the military is too intimidated and they don't dare it's technically outlawed, but they are still defying the rules and they exist. Anybody else that has anything to say against the government is immediately put away, tortured, killed, sent away, so that really there's only one party left, the National League for Democracy, which is led by Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi is a friend of mine. I've spoken to her 4 times in the past fortnight on some other matter, which I don't want to discuss on the radio. She is virtually a prisoner in her own house now. She can't move out. Even though she's not under house arrest, there are guards outside. I talked to her. Sue said, are the soldiers in front of your house armed? she also has a sense of humor. She said, "Uncle, I'm not curious enough to go and find out." I said, "That's good. Just stay behind in there." She's not free to move in and out of the house. She's not under house arrest, and yet she's not free. So I don't know what it is. This is the way the military plays the game. Their ideology, of course, is they want a democratic country, and they want to have a federal type of government that lets the local people decide how they want to be run. And it touches upon some type of a federalism to give those states local autonomy, the ones that Mr. Sargent and I have been talking about, these tribal people. But every time she comes out and wants to write a constitution, the army said that's against the law. If you do that, you'll go into jail for 20 years just to write the constitution. Something a student in Poli-Sci 101 on any campus might do. You can write a constitution, nobody has to pay any attention to it unless it's ratified, but they cannot even do that. So she is kind of closed. The Burmese press doesn't cover her. There are only two newspapers in the whole country, the New Light of Myanmar and Jaemon, and these are all run by the government, owned by the country. Compare that to Boulder, we have more than 2 newspapers right here. There's 1 TV station, 1 radio station. Everything is controlled by the government. So they have really embraced Thomas Jefferson to the fullest, who said, "Let me write the newspapers of the land, and I don't care who makes its laws." Well, the military regime owns and writes the newspapers, and they do care who makes the laws because it is themselves.
So, and at present, the resources, as we might say in economic terms, the means of production in Burma are nationalized.
Everything, exactly. And as far as you asked before about the other government, there is a government in exile. Burma has the advantage over any of them. I mean, there are so many countries where there's a lot of injustice happening, but Burma has the advantage of being the only one that I know of with a democratically elected alternative. We have a democratically elected party that has won an election and was just not allowed to go and rule. And in turn they have representatives abroad. They have people. I mean, most people have gone into exile. I mean, most of those students who rioted in '88 are either dead, they are in exile outside of the country and working or in prison. And the ones who are out in exile are basically the ones who are forming this Free Burma movement. And we just happen to have left earlier than that.
Sounds a bit like the Palestinian National Congress, which operated in exile for many years.
Correct.
Yes.
What would the National League for Democracy do with the resources of the country, with the land, the factories?
Well, I'm convinced that first of all they would really be very serious about stopping the drug production, about doing away with a lot of the corruption. I don't think any country in the world, especially in Southeast Asia, will do away with all of it. They are going to stop the flow of refugees into the neighboring countries. I mean, right now we have, I don't know how many 100,000 in Bangladesh and in Thailand. Nobody counts them. There must be about 1 million there. People who are, this is a labor force that has fled the country, and they want to go back. They don't want to live in other countries, not in Bangladesh, not in Thailand. They want to be there. They want to build. They want to make the country again. Maybe they can never make it what it was, but when I lived there, it was the rice bowl of Asia. I mean, it was the largest rice exporter in the world. Now they have to buy rice to feed their own people. And what they want is to do away with the injustices, to give people the freedom to do their own little traders. They are wonderful traders. Most people in Burma have a gift for trading, for bartering, for growing things that is very admirable. And now they are not allowed to do it. They are not. I mean, there's only one employer, and that's the government or the military. That's it. There is no private business.
Well, that's not a model that I would necessarily disagree with. The Cuban model is like that, where there's one employer, but they provide very well for all the people, of course. But where Burma's not providing for people.
No, they're not.
They are only providing for themselves.
The military. Well, the key word here is democracy. You ask what kind of an economic policy would the National League for Democracy pursue? politics and economics are two sides of the same coin. When they say we are looking for a government that is the will of the people, when the parliament elected by the people in a genuine election is allowed to take power, they're going to decide that the best economic system is the free market system. And the Burmese are pretty good at that, like Mrs. Sargent has said. And the government has no business owning these things. The purpose of government is to govern, not to be in business. The people who are doing the business now are in the government. These are military generals, the colonels, their wives, the cousins. They are all in the same clique, like the 7 families of El Salvador. So when the economy is turned loose and into the hands of ordinary people down to the real bottom rung of society, it is going to bloom when the government encourages them. Use your own talents to make it bloom. Burma is very rich in resources, but if the government has a hand, if the military government says everything the country owns is ours, then the people lose the incentive to do anything to make the economy grow.
Well, okay, I guess I don't understand that. It seems to me, if you look around the world, that if you place the economy in private hands, you end up with an extreme of rich people and a mass of poor people, which sounds like Burma today. So
but maybe what you can say, there may be large industries and so which should be controlled by the government. But it's the small trading, the small farming, the management of the natural resources, the environment. I mean, when I lived there, it was there were lots of gardeners and farmers who had their own little orange plantations, and some were just a few trees around the house, or they grew peanuts, or they were farmers, they grew tea. Well, it worked very, very well that they managed their own agricultural production and then sold it. And I don't think that is something where the government should step in at all. Nowadays, the government has stepped in, and I was told that the climate has changed there. Of course, I can't go back, but before it was teak forests and orange gardens. Nowadays, it's near desert because a lot of the teak had been cut down by the government, not because it was properly managed, but because whenever they needed some money, they cut down a few teak trees or a teak forest or something like that. And, people were they knew how to manage their own agricultural resources very well. And they weren't allowed to. And now look at what they have done. I mean, it's an environmental mess and it's an economic mess. And that is something which I consider very, very dangerous, because the people really are very good in managing their own resources.
Well, reflecting on your statement that what's the difference whether the military owns or the people own, they are going to be rich and poor. To a certain extent, that is true. But in a democratic society where there's a free movement of goods and services, more people will share in the wealth of the country than being concentrated in the hands of the few, which is the military as it is now. And so, if the economy is permitted to pursue its own path of progress, the creativity of the people will take care of itself. Even in the United States, let's face it, there are some families, some companies that are awfully rich. But the average person in walking the Pearl Street Mall in Boulder is not suffering that badly, if badly at all. They are able to purchase the goods and services they require, and they do pay taxes. And I don't think there will ever be a total utopian society where everybody gets the same share, but that would be turning very socialistic. But we must allow the people to develop their own talents and their own genius so that they can take care of themselves. So I have faith that when people are allowed to choose their own government, and the government is subject to the people's will, the politicians will make sure that they stay in power because of the people who voted him, so they'll take care of it. They'll boot them out every 4 years. We do that in the United States, boot out the bums, and we've done that quite well.
Well, we might just agree to disagree on some of those finer points. But you raised one interesting issue about how to do that and what the organization would look like. And when one of the articles that you were showing me just before we went on the air had a little banner headline that was admonishing the National League for Democracy for being inadequately prepared to make this transition.
Well, Bertel Lindner is also a friend of mine, the guy who wrote that article, and I fault him on
He's
that.
a troublemaker.
Yeah.
He's a
No,
troublemaker.
well,
Well, he's a writer. Maybe he's just teasing us. What Bertel fails to say is that any time the National League for Party raises its head to say something, many people are arrested. They don't arrest Aung San Suu Kyi, but the people underneath. I have a nephew in prison. He's serving a 25-year term. So they go after these people that they get that live outside the compound. So that Bertel is totally wrong on that issue. The National League for Democracy does have a policy. They do have a program. But every time they say, this is what we're going to do, people get arrested, they get beaten up, they get tortured. So that Aung San Suu Kyi also has to exercise extreme caution. Whenever I ask him to give him a suggestion on the phone, she always says, let me think about it. Well, she does a lot of thinking these days, but she is very careful in articulating her thoughts, because every time she says something that is out of line, people get put in the jail. They're going all the time. It's like a turnstile. Some people get in, some people get out. You know, it's a rotating assignment in prison, and prisons in Burma are very harsh.
So, well, it may be that he is pointing out something that's just true in the reality of the situation, that the military's control over the situation is so profound that it doesn't look like the National League can do much, at least for the time being.
Well, they can talk and say something. She's not free to say anything. And whenever she says something, the media doesn't print anything. They don't even... When she was released from house arrest, the government newspapers didn't say one word about it. The ordinary people in Burma gathered in front of the house. They picked up the news from the British Broadcasting Corporation and the Voice of America.
Shortwave.
That's where they got the first station. I wish KGNU was there. Now, Aung San Suu Kyi has a lot to say, and I'm hoping that she's going to say something very profound on January 26th out of Washington, D.C. I'm not at liberty to tell you what it's going to be, but watch the media for that purpose.
Yeah,
And
now
listen.
and I would like to say she also had a lot to say. She was invited to open the women's conference in Beijing, and then of course she wasn't allowed to leave. She was still under house arrest, or she was at that point she was confined to Rangoon, and so she wanted to send out a video, and she was going to say a lot about her platform. Well, the people who were doing the video weren't allowed in the country, and she smuggled one out. And I would like you to know, the military sent in her place a delegation led by a man, a major in the army, to as a delegation for Burma, saying that there were no qualified women in the country, so they had to send a male delegation to Beijing to the women's conference.
That does sound a little odd.
Yeah, that does seem a little odd.
should
I'm
have
glad
changed
you
his sex
agree
right
with
then and
me.
there.
But I guess that brings us full circle back to where we started. If the SLORC's control is so great, then it would appear that people in the diaspora, the Burmese diaspora, as it were, are going to have to organize and bring international pressure
That
to
is
bear.
the sadness that I have suffered through. People outside, many of them are afraid, so frightened by the military, they don't dare do anything. They keep quiet. There are a few big loudmouths like me who speak out, and that's the way it goes. Like in any civil war, like in any revolution, there are loyalists and there are people who are against. But there are many who are out there who don't dare speak out because they all have families. I have families too. I told you earlier that I have a nephew in jail. But the purpose of freedom is for those who are free to to make it possible the unfree to unshackle the unfree. So we must speak out. And the Burmese population outside is not very large, and they are scattered all over the world, so that they are intimidated, they are afraid. Now, going back to foreign policy, what can little things like Boulder City Ordinance and all that do? Well, in a democracy, things move from the bottom up, from the grassroots. We elect our representative. In a dictatorship, things move from up to the bottom. So the boycott itself will send a message that we in America are not going to put up with this narco regime, and if we stop these companies that do business there from propping that military regime, we will have made a giant stride.
Yeah, I would also like to say that there are there isn't a regime at this point that's more brutal than the Burmese. So many people who are outside don't dare to speak up because they have seen murder, torture, and horrible imprisonment of their relatives, and they are doing it. And I was born in Austria, you may have noticed the accent. A lot of what they're doing now reminds me very much of the Nazis, what the Nazis did in Austria and Germany and to the rest of the world. And at that point, the world didn't do very much, really. They just let Hitler go on for a while, Hitler didn't last, fortunately, and I'm an eternal optimist, and I also know that this government will not last no matter what they are trying, but I think it's our duty as citizens of this country, where we have the rights and privileges to speak up, and I think it's our duty to do something and help those people who are so oppressed, who can't help themselves. And I really think if our government doesn't do enough, and they are not, they're sitting in Washington fast and pretty, although, I really commend and applaud the bipartisan efforts to help Burma, and I think we all need to go in and help along, and we just can't be silent and see with that going on. I think there was too much silence during World War II the world over, and I don't think that should happen again.
And if listeners out there are interested in getting a hold of the Free Burma movement, how would they go about doing that?
Well, we have a group here, the Boulder Friends for Democratic Burma, and Dr. U Kyaw Win and I are co-chairs, and we are always eager to have people help us and are interested in us. We do have 2 telephone numbers.
Mine is 303-642-0880.
One more time, a little slower.
Area code 303-642-0880. That's one of my numbers. The other one is 714-831-2000.
And mine is 303-543-8939. And it's best to leave a message, and I do get back to people when I'm in town, which is, so again, 303-543-8939, Inge Sargent.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. You've been listening to Hemispheres on KGNU Boulder. I'm your host this evening, Richard Curtis, and we've been speaking with Inge Sargent and Dr. U Kyaw Win. Next week on Hemispheres, we'll have a special New Year's Eve show, a intellectual discussion of the Grateful Dead. So please join us for that. Coming up next, we have Corriente.